At Bin Century, we monitor tens of thousands of feed bins every day, and we add thousands more to our service every single month. Why? Because we can make people money immediately. It's not just about inventory levels. It's about out-of-feed events and feed reclaims and worker safety and FCR improvement at your barns. That's right, we can improve your FCR performance by multiple points. Go to bincentury.com and let us know how to help you.
Decoding the pork cutout, what it really means for hog producers. Welcome to Swine Web's Pork Industry Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Eadie. Today, we're diving into one of the most talked about topics in pork marketing right now, the pork carcass cutout. Joining me are two of the top voices in ag economics, Dr. Joe Parcell and Dr. Glynn Tonsor from Kansas State University. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for having us on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We're going to unpack recent debates, including my article on Swine Web, a follow-up analysis in National Hog Farmer, to understand what the cutout really means for producers, packers, and the future of pricing in our industry. So let's get right to it, guys. So understanding the cutout, that's a lot of feedback that I've got from people in the industry trying to understand what this is. Can you explain what the pork carcass cutout is, how it's calculated, and why it matters to producers and packers alike?
Yeah, maybe I'll give a first kind of broad comment and Joe can add to it. And I will apologize for the listeners. Both Joe and I are at K-State, and you're going to hear my the K-State furnace popping in the background a little bit. So you have to deal with that with our infrastructure, but hopefully it's fine. USDA puts out what they call their pork carcass cutout, right? And it is I would say, a estimated value, and I'm going to pause and reiterate estimated value of a standardized pork carcass. So, 55, 56% lean, 215 pounds. And I'm going to pause there. And this might sound very elementary, but I think this is important, is most people know no two hogs are exactly the same. Right? There's slight variations in weight or composition and so forth. And USDA sort of does its best to come up with this estimated value of a standardized carcass. And that gives us kind of a barometer of value for the industry. And I think that's really important to appreciate up front before we kind of get in the weeds. And we will get in the weeds here, Jim. I'm not trying to avoid that. But kind of remember that USDA is putting out this one number each day or weekly, depending on which report we'll refer to. And what they do is they work backwards from subprimal pork cuts. So, kind of reported market transactions. And then they sort of try to put the animal back together is the best way to describe that, right? So you've got, subprimal cuts that you work towards a primal. So they don't have a loin primal value and they don't have a ham primal value. They have cuts from the primals that they start with. And they try to rebuild, right, an estimated value of, in that example, the loin primal, the ham, as well as the other primals. And then they take those estimated primal values to come up to this total, carcass composite. I'm purposely trying to stay jargon free. The specific numbers that go into that are documented by USDA. There's a PDF on AMS's website on this, and they're using LMR data, so mandatory price reporting based data that we've had since 2013 to start that process and work towards that. I'm purposely repeating this, Jim, estimated value of a standardized carcass. It does not represent the value perfectly of any one hog in the system, but it's kind of a barometer of what our best effort would be, or as society for a moment there, of what that hanging carcass might have been worth.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of piggyback just a little bit on what Glynn said, and we'll go back to our infrastructure here at K-State, and that's why I've got my headphones on because it sounds like a jet engine here for me sometimes. So, I think the important, one of the important pieces of this, because it's a question we get asked a lot. Well, how does this different than the cattle, the box beef on there? And, I think we have to really do just kind of a step back and think about the industry overall and what's went on in those industries where, with box beef, it's just that it's a box of beef. Whereas with pork, and if you look at their reporting there, you think about all the ways that those subprimals that Glenn's talked about have had value added occurred to them, packaging. And so to back out that value to get back to that standardized carcass, we're talking about a lot additional steps that go on within the, within the pork industry. So.
So as we talk about labor and cost structure, in my article, I argued that certain costs like wages or plant labor increases aren't fully captured in today's cutout calculations. So if a plant gives employees a raise, should that be reflected in the cutout value? And why or why not, gentlemen?
So, so Jim, I'm going to give you different costs first, and then I'm going to talk labor. So I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to walk us towards it. Is, my understanding or description of the process would be things like depreciation value, electrical bill, utility bills, those kind of things, those kind of costs that are real in taking a live barrow and getting us a hanging carcass, and then all the other efforts are not, right, part of what these adjustments are, and they're not accounted for. And that's important just to kind of make a comment up front, is not all cost, right, are accounted for. And that's sort of why we don't see any formulas that are 100% of the reported cutout, right? So I'll give you that one kind of up front. But now get specific to labor. I would kind of both agree and disagree with you on the labor has a role. And I'm not trying to be an economist with two hands for a moment or be confusing. But what I would try to clarify is AMS once a year examines whether or not to adjust their labor number in the process. So in that sense, there is a periodic, right, potential update to the labor. But conversely, so that would be the slight pushback. But conversely, I would say if a plant gave a raise in, let's just say, middle of July for some reason, that would not show up in this exercise until the next January, right? So I both agree and disagree with the comment. Is nobody gives raises just on December 31st. I'm not that naive, right? I mean, I understand the real world works differently, but there is a periodic effort by USDA to update the labor over time. Again, it's one labor number for a standardized carcass kind of effort, does not match. The labor market in North Carolina and Oklahoma are not the same. I mean, I get that. I think we all recognize that. So it's sort of half agree, half disagree with the labor comment being part of the process.
Yeah, and again, I'll just add to that, and just thinking kind of a big picture here. It's not just labor that USDA updates. We've got cut loss in there, we've got yields, we've got packaging costs that are all getting done on that annual basis. So there's a whole cadre of adjustments, again, trying to get back to that standardized carcass cutout value.
And Jim, I'll add, you asked, should there be an adjustment? I think the three of us and our listeners are well aware there's mixed opinions on, right, yes or no to that should question. Joe and I, at least, we're trying to be analysts to improve the situation, right? We don't really take stands on these kinds of things. But the answer to should, in part, is tied to what's the goal of this number? If the goal is to give us a hanging standardized carcass, right, kind of a rebuild it what it looked like as close as we could to live animal, right? Then the way my head works is, yes, there needs to be some kind of, right, consideration for the labor cost incurred. If that's not the goal, if the goal is something different, and I'm not saying it's like beef, but if it's something different than what we're currently doing on pork, then maybe the answer is no, right? I would encourage us to kind of pause and say, what is the goal of this number? What's it supposed to reflect? And that would guide whether labor or not is part of that. And if it is, then how can we make the labor part work well? Would be sort of the order of operations, the way I would think through that.
Yeah, and just kind of piggyback on that again. We've had this calculation around for what, 30 some plus years, and his original intent is much different than how it's being used today in commerce. So there is an evolution going on.
Appreciate the insights. It's such a hot topic, guys. So, like market interpretation. So, the National Hog Farmer followed up with an article after my report suggesting that even if cutout methodology changes, it may not change hog prices. So, why might packers not pay more for pigs even if the cutout value rises?
Yeah, and I'll start off on that one, Jim. So, and this gets back to some work I've previously done with AMS, looking into the swine contracts library. And it's really when you start peeling back and look at all the specifications that are published there in the swine contracts library, you realize that a couple of things here. One is when they're using the cutout in their formulation of a hog price, they're using a percentage. So, and you're going to assume that that percentage is going to maybe change over time based on what's in the contract. The other thing that we learn from that is if you look at all the provisions that are specified in these contracts, there's typically a provision that if something like a change would occur at AMS and the way they report, not just every time it changes the level, but how they calculate that, it could trigger a renegotiation of that contract, which more than likely would cause that percentage adjustment to readjust to account for that.
And Jim, the only thing I would add on is to be clear for our listeners, at the extreme, if you took all labor out of the process, and again, neither Joe or I are advocating for that, but if that was occurring and nothing else changed, the next day, once that was implemented, the AMS reported value for cutout, right, that standardized number we're kind of alluding to, I do believe would be higher because you'd be taking, those deductions would not be there that are there like the day before. I don't want to like mislead folks on that. But what Joe and I are trying to clarify is most of the businesses done tied to that as it relates to the live animal segment is a reported number from AMS at some percentage, right? And our best guess of how the market would react to that over time, repeat negotiation kind of exercise, is you'd have a lower percentage of a bigger number because now you'd be basing it off something that is closer to that live animal before I incurred the cost to give me something sellable, would be the way that the buyer would approach that discussion. That's the part that changed compared to the old approach. And it's to be determined if a smaller percentage of a bigger number leads to a bigger net for a producer, right? If all we're doing is changing the mechanics of the role of labor, then it's not clear to me, at least, I'll put this just on me, that the end of the day paycheck for a producer would be a lot different than before. We'd have transaction costs, updating systems and renegotiating contracts, all that kind of stuff. But like ignore that, the new normal, it's not clear to me that it would be drastically different because I think you'd have a lower percentage of a bigger number that likely would be similar to before.
So what about the industry impact? What are the risks or unintended consequences of changing how the cutout is calculated? So for example, in terms of shifting cost burdens, contract negotiations, or market transparency.
I mean, I'll give one specific one on labor because that's like the part that's honed in on in a lot of these discussions is, currently the process is AMS considers a potential annual update to the labor number, right? And then imposes it. So the market is exposed, like, let's say early January each year to the risk of the labor number changing or not, right? And because of that, you've got that potential shock that can happen in early January with that, right? I think AMS does a good job of documenting when they do that. But as we work towards January, and we're sitting here early December, right? Both sides, buyers and sellers, the entire marketplace sort of has that unknown, right? What will that new labor number be? And if you took it out, that wouldn't be there, right? Is one change that could occur. Again, I'm not advocating for it. It would be different than before. Conversely, if you take it out and you just have like a summation of the subprimal values, it's no longer really reflecting the old hanging, right? It has a new interpretation. So what's the role of that? What's the trust of that? What's the use of that in the marketplace is hard to predict in advance because it'd be representing something different. So would it show up in fewer contracts than today? I don't know, right? But those are some of the risk and shifts that I would think would follow if we had a change by AMS.
Yeah, and I'll just add maybe an existing risk is, one side of this, the Packers, I mean, they do know, I mean, they're the ones submitting in these updates, and they're going to know ahead of time, on an individual basis, what they think might be these adjustments occurring in January. So maybe a risk right now, it's a little bit one-sided. Again, we don't know those distributions, so we don't know, exactly what that looks like.
And Jim, another one it's honestly a little broader than just the cutout, but you have a barrel and gilt reported price from USDA. We've got a cutout price, and at least when we're not in a shutdown, we have retail pork prices, right? And then we got the same thing in other species. But like as you go through a vertically connected industry, we have multiple reported values, and that's how we sort of understand markets the best we can. It's really important to understand there's nuance to all of those, right? So the retail pork number, for example, is driven by BLS grocery store effort, right? And you can debate whether it's good or not, how to make it better. We're talking about the cutout, understanding what it is, can we make it better? Even the barrel and gilt reported price for Southern, Iowa, how do you make it better? I think it's really important that we back up and kind of at times, and Joe and I are the geeks to try to do this with Jim, you and others, is understand what each is attempting to represent and what it isn't trying to represent. And a lot of times they're used for things they are not intended to. And I'm not trying to put blame on anybody for that, but we got to be careful because that can confuse producers, right? It's going to be mainly producers that listen to this. And I encourage us to take the time to understand, in that example, all three levels, right? What we have to work with, what it means, what changes have occurred over time or not. That's a homework assignment from an academic, I know, but I do think that's really important here.
So we're getting in the weeds today, aren't we, gentlemen? So good time to wrap up future outlook. So looking ahead, what should producers be watching regarding cutout methodology, packer pricing practices, and long-term impacts on producer profitability?
I'll kick this one off. And, one of the things, and we probably, at least in our report and in the follow-up, we probably didn't touch on this enough, and we've talked about the cutout, we've talked about a carcass, but, maybe it's time to increasingly for producers to think about the whole hog. One of the things we don't talk about is very much is the voluntary side of this, and that's the byproducts that are coming out, the cheeks, the lungs, the spleens, et cetera. And, you look at those values, I mean, they have increased over time. And, maybe it's even thinking beyond the way we've typically thought of a carcass. Maybe some of the lower hanging fruit might be outside of that carcass value for some producers.
Yeah, agreed. And if you're trying to get like a summation of the total animal's value, that's really important to recognize. And Joe's comment would be even more important today than 10, 20 years ago, because the market value of some of those products has grown, right? Is part of why Joe's highlighting it. And I'm reminding us of that as a segue from my response to you, Jim, would be is, remember, we're talking about a cutout, like an effort to be a standardized kind of one number. And I tried to make the comment earlier, in reality, no two hogs are the exact same, therefore the value isn't the same. We'll go a little further with that. USDA has they call it their specialty bucket, right? So pork products that carry a claim. And, a housing claim would be a very prevalent one we're all familiar with. Use of antibiotics or not, there's lots of examples now. That kind of bucket, or that share of the industry, has grown notably in the last several years. It's not something we've talked about here today, but in many ways, I would argue economically, there's more value today in that space and understanding it, and whether or not it's part of how we do business, and whether or not we ought to change how that shows up and so forth. Quite frankly, Jim, I think there might be more economic value and importance in that discussion than the nuance of labor. And I don't mean that to be kind of a jerk in our discussion, but a lot of the discussion's been honed in on, is the right number on labor being used or not, how we make that better, and there's a place for that. But I'm not so sure it wouldn't be trumped, kind of pun intended, by specialty products, right? So I would leave you with that kind of comment.
Any final thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, maybe just to clarify for the listeners out there right now, the only bucket that's not included in that cutout calculation is the specialty products that Glynn was just talking about there. So again, going back to where the biggest bang for the buck and just kind of looking at things would be is what impact is either adding in that specialty product. And again, maybe that's not getting back to where we want to be, or do we separate out and have a separate cutout or carcass cutout for specialty in there? So,
and Jim, if I may, I know we're a little late on time, but we're a podcast, we can do this. I think it's really important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is, most of our listeners have an interest in the topic, and they probably know, right? Some version of this cutout is either directly or indirectly important to their business. But it is easy in the current environment, right? When you think through federal government operations and so forth, to misinterpret industry dialogue on this as questioning the value of this. And I think we got to be very careful on that. The currently reported efforts by AMS have notable use, not just in the U.S. pork industry, they do in Canada as well, as most of our listeners know, right? That's not meant as a defense to never change it. Don't take it that way. But we do need to be careful how we have these discussions, and always make it clear they're passionate discussions because they're important and they're central to doing business. And there's always room to have the discussion and maybe make them better and modernize over time. I'm all for that. But we got to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater or send that signal by accident, because there's a notable risk of that at the moment.
Well, Dr. Glynn Tonsor, Dr. Joe Parcell, Thanks for joining us, decoding the pork cutout.
Thanks for having us
Thank
on,
you.
Jim.